शुरू कर।
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. In times of being forced to maintain social distancing, Lex Discourse team invites you all to its 6th webinar, which was initiated to lift our spirits and be engaged in learning through intellectuals from the legal fraternity with the help of electronic media. Today, we are honored to have Honorable Justice Sri R.M. Borde, former judge, Bombay High Court, to enlighten us on the scope and limitations of writ jurisdiction under Article 226 and 227 of the Constitution of India. Your Lordship requires no introduction, but for those new to the field, I would take the liberty to formally introduce him in brief. Having completed BA from Marathwada University and LLB from ILS Law College, Pune, he was enrolled as an advocate in 1980 and joined the chamber of his father, a distinguished advocate practicing on criminal side, late Sri Manohar Rao Borde at Bede. On establishment of the bench of Bombay High Court at Aurangabad, he shifted to Aurangabad in 1981 and joined the chamber of Honorable Mr. Justice A.B. Naik as a junior and associated with him for 5 years. During his advocacy period, my lords conducted various civil, criminal, and constitutional matters with service and cooperative cases. He also rendered service as a part-time lecturer in Manikchand Pahade Law College, Aurangabad, which gives us a glimpse of a teacher in him. My lord was elevated in 2006 and during his tenure of judgeship had delivered various landmark judgments, giving due deliberation at times to the societal needs suo motu till his retirement in 2019. Having him as a judge at Aurangabad was a blessing for young advocates because his lordship always encouraged young talent, and that's something we will always be thankful for. We are truly delighted to have your lordship. Before the session starts, I would like to inform our attendees that the webinar will be followed by a question and answer session. Attendees can post their question in the chat box. I now open the platform for my lord and request him to begin the session. Sir, over to you.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Your team persuaded me to open the books and read after this initiation of pandemic. I'm thankful for them. The advocates who are practicing here since last few years may be aware. There was a function organized at the conference hall at the High Court at our High Court. I think Justice Mohit Shah was invited, and then President of the High Court made certain demands. During the course of his address, he told the Honorable the Chief Justice that the High Court has got the powers under Article 226 to issue writs, and those powers are wide enough. So you can meet any demand that can be made. He said that the powers exercisable by the High Court are to the extent of stopping a flying plane. So, and he made certain further demands. So there, it may be a bit exaggeration, but the fact remains that the powers are wide enough, but there are checks and balances. Those are governed by the settled principles, and one has to follow the judicial discipline, the principles laid down by the Supreme Court as regards the exercise of powers under its jurisdiction. I may not go into the technical details tracing the history of introduction of the writ petition, but you are aware that the origin finds place in the British jurisprudence. This concept of writ originated from the orders issued by the king, the king's bench in England. The common law was not the common law which is prevailing in England, which is practiced in England, was not sufficient to meet all the contingencies. And as a last resort, in order to address the extraordinary circumstances and seek redressal for extraordinary grievances, the petitions were being filed to the king. Those were dealt with by the king's bench, and the orders, written orders used to be issued. Those orders were called the writ. Those orders were issued in the name of the king. And were the royal orders bearing the royal seal. The expenses those were incurred for securing the orders, filing the proceedings, those were termed as the purchase of writ. In fact, the concept of purchase of justice may find bit maybe a bit offending also. It is possible that nowadays to approach the higher courts, to approach the Supreme Court, it may be beyond the reach of a poor person. And it is said there is often a criticism against the judiciary that if only those who are rich and having resources can engage the best counsels, can secure the orders from the highest courts, can put forth their matters, can avail of the judicial remedies promptly. But with the advent of the public interest litigation and the expansion of the jurisdictional scope during the developmental period after the framing of the Constitution, it has become quite easier for an poorest of poor, a person residing at the corner of the country, to transmit a communication to the Supreme Court or the High Court, putting forth his grievances. If there is a abridgment or encroachment upon his fundamental rights, fundamental freedom, even the letters are considered as the petition, and the grievances are tried to be redressed. With the development of or I may say that the directive principles of the state policy also provide for free legal aid. We talk of justice at the doorsteps of the litigant. The high courts as well as the courts below are providing legal aid to the needy and poor so as to secure the justice. So the concept of purchase is not relevant here. That is the ancillary observation. So far as the development of writ petitions in India is concerned, the development of writ jurisdiction in India is concerned, if you trace the history, that it goes back to Regulating Act of 1773, under which the Supreme Courts were established. Supreme Court at Calcutta was established, having the powers to issue it. That was in 1774. Then charter high courts were established. That those initially those were termed as Supreme Court at Bombay and Madras in 1801 and 1823. And latest patent was issued to these courts, authorizing them to issue the writs. Later on, these so-called Supreme Courts were brought to the status of replaced by the high courts. So these presidency high courts, that's Calcutta, Bombay and Madras, were having the powers to issue writs. though several other high courts were established, but those did not have the powers to issue. This uniformity was brought about in after the framing of the Constitution in 1950, and the power or the right to judicial remedies to secure to approach the High Court to the Supreme Court under Article 32 and to the High Courts under Article 226 of the Constitution of India has been introduced. The power under 32 exercisable by the Supreme Court is limited to the enforcement upon the fundamental rights of the person. The judicial remedy provided under right to judicial remedy provided under Article 32 itself is a part of the fundamental right. The remedy is for protection of the fundamental rights, and sub-article 1 says that the remedy for protection of fundamental rights is guaranteed. It's a guarantee under the Constitution. The power to issue the writs, orders or directions in the nature of the writ of habeas corpus, mandamus, prohibition, quo warranto, and certiorari for enforcement of the fundamental rights find mentioned in sub-article 2 of Article 32. Though the powers exercisable by the Supreme Court under Article 32 are in respect of the breach of the or violation of the fundamental rights, there are other powers with the Supreme Court which can also be exercised. So Article 139 is an enabling provision authorizing the Parliament to make a law empowering the Supreme Court to exercise powers under sub-article 2 of Article 32 for protection of other rights as well. But the law has not yet been framed, and probably there is no need arising because the Supreme Court can exercise the power apart from Article 32. 142 is there. Then 136 of the Constitution of India is in the nature of a remedy provided to a litigant to approach the Supreme Court by presenting SLP. So far as 142 is concerned, the powers are exercisable to do complete justice. Wherever you find that there is some gap between the law that is existing and the right available to a citizen, and the field is untouched, then the Supreme Court can issue the guidelines. You must be aware that in the matters relating to sexual harassment at workplace, the Supreme Court pronounced a verdict and issued certain guidelines. There are several instances wherein such a gap which finds place in order to render complete justice, Supreme Court issues certain guidelines. So it makes the Supreme Court all too powerful. So far as the High Courts are concerned, the powers exercisable under Article 226 are concerned. Those are concurrent so far as issuance of directions for protection of the fundamental rights, as well as the other rights. The High Court can issue the directions, orders, and the writ in the nature of the writ of certiorari, mandamus, quo warranto, and all other fight after. So apart from exercise of powers for protecting the fundamental rights, the High Courts can exercise the power under Article 226 for enforcement of other rights also. Sub-article 2 makes a reference to exercise of such powers necessary for issuing it. So the scope of Article 226 in that sense is wider than the powers exercisable by the Supreme Court under Article 30. Now, so far as the scope of jurisdiction is concerned, you must be, there is no need to tell that it is all embraced, everything is embraced within the fold of the jurisdiction. With the complexities of life and complexities of the problems, with the advent of new technology, there are new problems posed before. And in order to answer those new problems, this situation, the modern situation, the rich jurisprudence is developed. So development of law is, as is said, is a sign of a sort of a progress, liveliness. If you stop the development, if the law stops growing, then there is a stagnation. I will tell you the example that we had a very conservative approach so far as issuance of writ against the public bodies, state-controlled corporations. Now, with the advent of the jurisdiction and with the advent of this development and the interpretation put through by the Supreme Court, you must be aware that in the matter of BCCI, the Supreme Court has opened a new vista. If a private body is also interested with the public functions and is delivering public good, then irrespective of the fact that the state is not providing any finances, the regulations are not framed by the state, but the body is regulated by its own set of rules. In respect of certain matters which come within the domain of public functions, and it can be issued. This is a departure from the earlier view, earlier stand, and has opened a new vista. So, coming to the subject, now when you speak of the wider scope of exercise of jurisdiction, you must bear in mind the limitations provided for exercise of such jurisdiction. There are self-imposed restrictions as well as those restrictions are based on certain principles laid down by the directives issued by the Supreme Court or the judgments delivered by the Supreme Court, which are of course binding on the high courts. And in order to maintain the judicial discipline, a particular pattern, the restrictions need to be followed. Now, if you briefly consider, I would briefly speak about the various types of various types of writs issued. Now, firstly, take an example. When you speak of habeas corpus, writ of habeas corpus, it is for purposes of providing a remedy against the illegal confinement of a person. If a person is in detention, which is a precondition that if he is in confinement, and if the confinement is illegal, then redressal can be asked for by approaching the Supreme Court. Now, the detention has to be an illegal. Now we find that various detention days under various detention laws, preventive detention laws, orders are issued and those are examined by the court. But apart from that, grievances are made that and people approach to the court saying that all right, such and such person is detained by a group of persons or some authority or some maybe for some illegal purpose. Now it's sometimes in the case of a bonded labor, a labor is forced to work at a particular establishment or with some agriculturist. In case of a sugarcane laborers, one matter I remember was presented to the High Court, saying that the Mukaddam have detained the persons. Then the High Court, if such a complaint is made, first of all, it would be the responsibility of the High Court, maybe it's a mandatory requirement to direct the concerned authorities, the police authorities, to produce the body of the person before the court and to take all the steps necessary for tracing this that individual. I remember a case wherein some traders dealing with gold in the bordering area were taken away in the state of Andhra Pradesh and were kept in confinement for recovery of certain amount. So initially, after the establishment of bench, during the initial period, a writ was issued to the state authorities of the Maharashtra state as well as the Andhra Pradesh state to produce the person before the court. Similarly, in one example, one person dealing with some person having some contractual obligation was taken away from the state of Maharashtra and was lodged in another state. He was found in confinement at the residence of some minister of that. High Court issue took a very stern action and directed production of the person before. So this is a speedy remedy for protection of an individual against the illegal unauthorized acts or exercise of muscle power. Apart from this illegal confinement, the writ of habeas corpus many times asked in the matrimonial matters also for securing custody of a minor child. If there is disharmony between the husband and wife, and if a minor is taken away without the consent of a spouse, and if one of them approaches the court saying that there is a grave danger to the person, to the kid, so we find that many times the writ is issued. The object is not to settle the matrimonial disputes between the parties. That is not the object, to settle any dispute or set at rest the controversy. But the sole object is that the person who is said to be missing shall be produced before the court. So in custody matters, the primary concern, as has been laid down by the Supreme Court in various judgments, is the welfare of the minor. When the child is produced before the court makes an inquiry as to if the child is up and has reached the age of understanding, that with whom he would like to stay. And the wishes of the minor are always honored. But at the same time, the law governing the guardianship, the custody, cannot be ignored. If it's a girl child and of minor age, and if only mother is entitled to the custody, the court has to take into consideration the law governing the subject. The court does not enjoy a freedom to pass any orders which would be violative of the express provisions of law. One has to honor the court has to honor. One has to keep in mind the provisions of law and any order that the court may be passing in exercise of external jurisdiction shall not be contrary to the express provisions of law. Habeas corpus petitions, normally here we come across certain matters wherein the estranged lovers also approach the court saying that, look here, the girl is under unauthorized custody of the parents, she wants to meet me, she wants to marry me, but they are not allowing. I remember during my junior days, such a petition was presented by me. The boy who was having some affectionate relations with the girl approached the court, saying that, look here, the parents are not allowing the girl to meet me, I want to marry her. And she wrote certain letters expressing that there is a danger to her life, and it may happen that there would be a case of an honor killing also, because they were of different castes. The court took cognizance of the complaint, but ultimately the girl was not pressed. Probably she has vanished, as if she has vanished in the air. The matter was referred to the CBI. CBI also could not do anything. It was referred to the CID crime branch, but no fruitful purpose was served. Ultimately, the court closed the chapter after 1 or 2 years, directing the investigating authorities to keep the search on until the body of the person is, or the person is presented alive or dead. So these are the summary remedies which are provided for protection of an individual freedom. Now, when we speak of mandamus, it's not directed against the person, but now as I have referred to private person, authority, or a corporation. The writ is directed against a person exercising the certain authority under the law, an authority, corporation, inferior tribunal, requiring them to do a particular thing which pertains to his or his office, their office, and is in the nature of a public duty. So the requirements are that whether the party approaching the court or the petitioner approaching the court has a clear and specific legal right to the relief claimed by him, whether there is a duty imposed upon the authority by a law to perform such function, whether such duty imposed upon the authority or cast upon the authority is of an imperative ministerial character involving no judgment or discretion on the part of the respondent. Now there has to, whether the petitioner has any remedy, has any other remedy other than by way of an mandamus or approaching the court. So whenever an writ petition calling upon the court to issue a mandamus is presented, the first question asked is, so what is the legal right? Whether the person against whom the writ is claimed is bound to perform a duty. Now this REIT is designed, this remedy is designed to see that every authority in the state and including the government acts bona fide within the limits of its power. And when there is an abuse or misuse of the power or its jurisdiction, the court's jurisdiction is invoked, and it would be incumbent upon the courts to afford justice to the individual. Now, so far as the exercise of the writ of mandamus is concerned, apart from the certain executive and administrative matters, wherein the duty is cast upon the public authorities to perform certain functions, such a writ is asked for. There are numerous examples of issues of enforcement of writ of mandamus. Then limitations, those are imposed so far exercise of the powers which judiciary is concerned. One has to approach the court at the earliest opportunity. If there is a delay or latches, those are required to be explained. So delay and latches, those are not, that is circumscribed or classified by any codified law like the law of limitation. In certain matters, a delay of approaching the court by a few days would be fatal. Whereas in certain matters, even if the client approaches the court after about 20 years, the petition would be entertained. So there can be no uniform rule so far as the delay and latches. Take a case example of an election matter. If the process of election is on, is already started, and according to petitioner, whatever the lacuna that is there, it can be corrected without stalling the process of election. He has to approach the court as expeditiously as possible before the steps in furtherance of the election process are taken. But in certain matters, in case wherein person is deprived of his property without taking due recourse to the provisions of law, he may approach the court, explain the delay maybe after 20 years. In some that Bangalore matter, the delay of 20-25 years has been condoned, and the Supreme Court had directed that the property be returned back to the claimant. But at the same time, in one case arising from Aurangabad, wherein the properties were taken during the drought season in 1972. Here, though the petitioners approached the court maybe after about 20-25 years, the High Court granted relief and directed the state to pay compensation, determine it and pay. The matter went to Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said that there is a huge delay and latches. Supreme Court has also considered the aspect of burden on the exchequer, because hundreds of acres of tract of lands in order to provide the work during the drought season was taken over in 1972. And the Supreme Court refused to entertain in that and dismissed the petition on the ground of delay and latches. So there are no set standards as such. It has to be examined as per the exigencies of the matter which is listed before. In certain matters, one has to approach with the expeditious, with the utmost speed, whereas in certain matters, you can afford to wait. Now take the recent case which the Supreme Court is dealing with, the public interest petition, wherein thousands of migrants stranded in the state, various states, started walking back to their places of origin, to their state. initially there was reluctance to interfere. But ultimately, when certain cognizance was taken and certain directions were issued, probably it's too late. The people have reached their destination and they had suffered the agony. Some of the high courts had taken care to redress the grievances. But that is most important, that you must understand the urgency of situation. There has to be an urge to do the justice. Sometimes the people approach you, sometimes such situations are created that it becomes difficult for somebody to approach you. Then the jurisprudence has developed the recently. When you talk that our judicial system, justice delivery system, is an instrument of social engineering, we have to take cognizance of all such things which are happening around us. So while I deal with the public interest part, I will elaborate on this. But these are the limitations. This is a delay and latches. Then another is availment of an alternate remedy. Whether often a question is asked when you ask for certain writ, don't you have another remedy? The other remedy, availability of an other remedy is a bar, but it's not an absolute bar. The other remedy has to be an efficacious alternate remedy. Suppose if you approach the court for issuance of certain directions which are of purely a civil nature, which can be dealt with in a suit, the court will naturally ask you to go to the civil court for redressal of your grievances. But if the urgency of situation demands that the alternate remedy that has been provided would be an eyewash, or it would not be a remedy at all, then the courts are not powerless to entertain the petition and exercise the jurisdiction. It's a rule of prudence instead of a constitutional bar. The availability of an alternate remedy, not a constitutional bar in exercise of powers under Article 256, but it's a rule of prudence in certain matters. If the situation demands, the court can take problem. I recollect a matter which was presented to us at Mumbai, wherein certain encroachers, maybe they call the court trust calls them encroachers, who were settled on the land belonging to the court trust. They approached us saying that they have been issued notices to vacate the premises which they are occupying since about 50, 60 years. They have right to remain on the premises. The court trust cannot evict us, because if at all they have to evict, they should follow the provisions or the procedure prescribed under Public Premises Eviction Act. One of the bylaws framed by the court trust for causing eviction of unauthorized persons on their property provided for only a 12 hours. Now, if you ask them to approach a civil court, alternate forum for redressal of their grievances, the 12 hours notice, by the time you approach, probably they would have been approved. So the challenge was basically to the bylaws. We dealt with that, from different verdicts. May not be necessary. But in such, looking to the urgency of the situation, one has to examine. Many a times, the people do not get sufficient time frame to approach an alternate forum. Then in such situations, you may grant relief for a limited period so as to enable the person to approach an alternate forum. So this there can be a practical answer or some answer to the solution, some solution for the problem. So in at many places we find that many municipalities issued notices under municipal laws calling upon the encroachers or the occupants on the public or the municipal properties to evict. But there are remedies provided, but sometimes they don't get the time, and probably the solution would be that if first of all they must be heard, principles of natural justice must be followed. There has to be a notice, there has to be a reply, affording an opportunity to tender their contentions or reply. Whatever the controversy that has to be dealt with has to be decided. And there has to be a sufficient time for them to approach an higher forum for redressal of their grievance, some alternate forum. Then in such matters, what you do is that grant them a limited protection. Sometimes if you are occupying a part of the street, then probably you may not have any right. But if you enter into an disagreement and evict them on the ground of efflux of time, he may have some remedies. Somebody is in settled position, he may have some remedy. So the redressal has to be sought for, or redressal should be there, looking to the situation and urgency of the situation, looking to the facts and circumstances of this case. As I have said that there has to be an urge to do the justice, right? Urge to understand the problem and to find out some workable solution for the problem. And the relief can be molded in such fashion. The writ jurisdiction gives you that much space for the court to pass appropriate orders for doing complete justice. That has to be thought of. Now there is another limitation whereunder you probably may not cause interference, and that is if the person comes or the petitioner comes with the controversial issues or the facts which are stated are disputed questions of fact. Normally, when you exercise jurisdiction, you proceed on the basis of the admitted fact. Now, at certain quarters, sometimes the facts themselves are disputed. Then, if an elaborate inquiry into the facts is required for grant of relief asked for, then it is desirable that you relegate the party to the alternate forum. But sometimes the situation is such that the court may think it appropriate to deal with certain issues of fact also. Those can be examined or can be settled on the basis of the affidavits. You can call upon the party to put the affidavits. Issuance of commissions. Sometimes you issue a commission to look to the ground situation and thereafter determine the issue or come to the conclusion. Many times we issue commissions. Sometimes a person comes with a grievance saying that, look here, there is a damage to the public property. Or when there is a sand mining, there is a rampant in our region. Somebody comes with says that, look here, there are large number of beaches in the river and there is large scale theft of the sand. The usual reply of the administration is that no, nothing has happened. It's everything is okay. Then the court cannot itself go and find out as to what is the ground situation. Then you may ask the higher officer like an director of the district or the commissioner to verify the situation, to have the inspection and file an affidavit. So it's not that such type of limited investigation can also be had. Sometimes you issue a commission also for finding out the facts. When situation demands, in Bombay, there was a fire to a very exotic restaurant and few people died. There was a lot of hue and cry. The questions were raised as regards the legality of the structure. The various permissions, those were issued by various authorities according to the people or public or the relatives of the deceased person. Those permissions were issued without verifying the ground realities. The norms for operating or running the restaurant were flouted. Now a very senior police officer, retired police officer, having impeccable record, approach saying that this needs to be investigated. Now there were disputed questions. Somebody says that all right, this is the ground situation, others are denying it. What you can do? You ask for the reports of various authorities. And ultimately, we thought it appropriate to issue a commission. We directed that some experts be asked, apart from a judicially trained person, to look into the grievances, because the issue touches the public safety, quite a sensitive issue. As it's not an isolated case. At many a times it is reported that such things happen in the urban areas. So in order to settle such issues, we directed a constitution of an inquiry committee, a commission for inquiring into that. And the report of the committee was received. But the larger issue still, I think, remain regarding the illegality of the construction. That is very rampant in the area. All these mill lands. The issue was basically regarding the illegality of construction of the mill lands. That was raised, probably that has not been addressed. I don't know what has happened. But there are certain areas, in order to meet the exigencies or to do the complete justice, to grant relief in a proper manner, if some limited investigation is required, that can also be done. It's also not a complete part. This so far as the mandamus is concerned. Now there is another aspect, one thing, so far as all types of relief, when somebody approaches a report seeking relief, it's a common law, the jurisdiction is based on the principles of natural justice, fair play, and it's an equitable remedy. Any dishonesty, suppression has no place in the proceedings. Somebody comes to the court withholding certain facts, misleading the court, or with an ulterior motive, then such grievances are not to be entertained. One who seeks equity must do it. One has to come with the clean hand. But I may tell you, many a times what happens, the person who approaches may be dishonest, may have something else in his mind, may have some design. But if the issue raised above in the matter is of a public importance and which needs to be considered, then keeping aside all other aspects, you can deal with the issue. One may come to a court saying, one may say that the person has suppressed certain things. He has some ulterior motive. He is a rogue character. But the issue that has been raised, if it is of a utmost public importance, that issue can be dealt with. And Many a times in practice also we overlooking all these things, deal with the issue. But somebody may not be entitled to a relief if he suppresses the facts, if he comes to the court with distorted version, if he himself is guilty of certain fraudulent acts. But those aspects or those deficiencies are required to be weighed. This is a general principle applicable for all the types of writs. Now, turning to the writ of quo warranto, you are aware that it is essentially issued to prevent the usurper to occupy a public office. To ask a person, question a person as to under what authority you are occupying the person, occupying the public office. A judicial inquiry is contemplated. Occupying a public office, if the allegations are that he is ineligible or is not competent to occupy the person, under what authority you occupy the office, that's a question posed. For the rule of locus standi is not relevant for this. Many times we come across when you challenge the appointment of in certain matters, vice chancellor's appointments were challenged, 2-3 matters which you are doing. Say that you don't answer the qualification requirements, you are not eligible to occupy the office. Then, in such matter, the writ of quo warranto is asked for. And one has to answer that, in fact, he fulfills the eligibility requirement and is within the bracket of eligibility. The rule of locus standi is not applicable. Now, if you uphold the contentions and say that a person is ineligible, then by a fresh order he cannot be appointed. Otherwise, it would be defeating them. Now, turning to the writ of certiorari and prohibition. Certiorari is issued for quashment of the orders which are issued by an authority who is empowered to deal with the issue or render a decision, judicial decision, which has the duty to act judicially. If that authority acts in excess of the authority, exercises the jurisdiction which is not vested in the authorities, or jurisdiction in exercise of jurisdiction in excess of the authority, or refuses to exercise the jurisdiction vested in the authority, the jurisdictional error can be corrected. The endeavor is to ensure that the judicial body, which is entrusted with the functions of rendering the decision, remains within the bounds. Now, in exercise of this writ, you seek directions for quashment of the orders of the tribunal, a judicial, quasi-judicial body, which has assumed the jurisdiction, and if there is any jurisdictional error, as I have said, there need not be an in-depth probe into the factual controversy or the findings which are recorded based on facts. So, reappreciation of facts. If on the basis of certain facts and view is taken, if the view is a reasonable one, then that need not be upset. That need not be investigated. If there is an error apparent on the face of record, that can be corrected. Apparent on face of record means if the error is palpable, without making an in-depth analysis, the error is apparent, that can be correct. Another aspect is, it is not necessary to cause interference merely because it would be permissible. It would be permissible. The interference, if it is required in order to render justice, then only the interference need be caused. Merely because certain order doesn't fit in the four corners of law, you need not cause interference. If it renders certain injustice, leads to some prejudice, or puts an litigant to a disadvantageous position, then only, and if the justice requires, then it is necessary to call. Otherwise, it's not mandatory for the court to step in wherever there is a certain amount of illegality. Certain wrong decisions also tend to meet the ends of justice. In such matters, the court has to make a choice whether to cause interference or not. I will tell you one simple example. In one matter under RERA, Real Estate Regulatory Authority passed certain orders directing a builder to deposit certain amount. That was towards the compensation payable to the persons who had booked the flats with the builder. Flats were booked certain 15 or 20 years back. The building was not completed. People approached the RERA. Then authority directed payment of compensation. The appeal was presented to, I don't know, so for the appeal it's remedy. Then in order to execute that order, those litigants, those flat owners approached the revenue authorities for enforcing the recovery of amount. The revenue authorities went there and put a seal to the office and attached it. The builder's office is sealed. He said that my computer is there, my business has come to a standstill, I cannot function at all. How I am to, even checkbooks are inside, how I can pay the amount. And he pointed out one section under the Land Revenue Code saying that all right, you can attach my property, put a proclamation, put it to sale, but you cannot put physically a seal on the property. He was right in saying that in another precedence, in another matter, a direction was issued for removal of a seal. He pointed out that decision. But the court dealing with the matter has equity jurisdiction. You cannot forget the plight of the persons who are waiting there 15 or 20 years for securing the poor persons have paid money, and they were waiting either for possession of the flat or for refund of money. And we ask the litigant, are you willing to deposit certain amount? Deposit at least the 50% which they have claimed. He said the order is illegal. I am on that. You cannot support the order, and that has to be set aside. So, right, we told them that look here, we are exercising an equity jurisdiction. Every illegal order need not be stayed or set aside. And we imposed the condition of, ultimately there was some heated argument, and we put a condition of deposit of amount. We made it clear in the order that he has refused to accept the liability was in fact admitted. There was no controversy so far as the liability. In such matter, it's not necessary merely because there is some violation of some provision of law. In order to complete justice, you need not exercise the jurisdiction for it. Put a condition, all right, ask him to deposit money. Went to Supreme Court said, all right, you have to pay. So, sometimes some error of law, some error in passing an order also leads to rendering justice. Those orders need not be set aside. In election matters sometimes, all right, there would be some defect in procedure somewhere or else. You don't crash or set aside the election. Sometimes the person who complains may lose at the end of the election. at the end of the round. So the equity jurisdiction exercisable by the court is to make the complete justice, to render justice to the person. If your orders lead to put the litigant in a disadvantageous position who has approached you, you need not issue such orders. Then this is so far as the certiorari is concerned, and the prohibition also directing the authority, judicial authority or quasi-judicial authority, if he has no jurisdiction to entertain and if he is bent upon to entertain or certain proceedings, you can issue a restraint order directing the tribunal or any authority who is threatening to assume the jurisdiction which is not vested in him by law. So this is so far as the various types of writs are concerned. Now, so far as general propositions of exercise of jurisdiction are concerned, as I have stated that it's not an jurisdiction exercisable by the High Court under Article 226 or jurisdiction exercisable by the Supreme Court under Article 32. It's not an ordinary jurisdiction, it's an extraordinary jurisdiction meant for extraordinary purposes. It's an expeditious remedy that you call it. Now, so far as the expeditious part is concerned, I have serious doubts about it. It has become a sort of another civil court dealing with civil suits. Now, every year you get a flow of about 14,000 to 15,000 writ matters. It becomes difficult for a judges sitting here with their available strength to deal with the matters at admission. So, where is the expeditiousness? It's an expeditious remedy. But many times, because of the system and the workload, good causes are rendered infructuous, and the litigants are put to disadvantage. So one has to make a choice. One has to fix the priorities, which matter should be taken up first. So though you call it a speedy remedy, in case of it is not so speedy as is conceived. But still, in case of the violation of fundamental rights or certain grave situations, the courts come to the rescue and it's a remedy, expeditious and a speedy remedy, as in case of issuance of writ of habeas corpus or such remedy. Now, so far as the procedure part is concerned, the proceedings are not impeded by the rules of procedure. It's not impeded by the rules of procedure code as the civil courts are. And the technical rules, the jurisdiction is not impeded by the rules of the technicalities. But the procedure has to be evolved in order to ensure the expeditious disposal or speedy delivery of justice. In order to meet the extraordinary circumstances and extraordinary exigencies, an extraordinary remedy is required. And therefore, the proceedings of writ are not impeded by any set of procedural norms, procedural rules. As I have said, the rules of limitation are also not applicable. But one has to look at the aspect of laches and delay. If the relief claimed is capable of being granted, then in spite of the rules of technicalities, and the procedural aspects of limitation. There is no impediment in granting the relief. The jurisdiction exercisable by the High Court under Article 226 is the original jurisdiction, whereas the jurisdiction exercisable by the High Court under Article 227 is concerned. Under the supervisory jurisdiction under Article 227, you deal with the orders passed by the lower courts or tribunals. So far as the 227 is concerned, if you read the provision, if you read the article, it's a power of superintendence and control over the lower courts and tribunals. So in order the object is to ensure that the tribunals and the lower courts remain within the bounds of their jurisdiction. So if the orders are passed, you find the origin of the jurisdiction exercisable under 226, 227 in the old code of criminal 480 something, some section is there, and 115 of the code of civil. The revisional jurisdiction exercisable under section 115 is circumscribed by the three aspects: whether the order that has been passed is in excess of jurisdiction or is without jurisdiction. That is, if there is any jurisdictional error is there, or that the court has refused to exercise the jurisdiction vested in it by law. Now, so far as the powers exercisable under Article 227 are concerned, you don't probe into the questions of fact. The findings recorded by the tribunal or the authorities based on the appreciation of facts need not be interfered with unless it is pointed out that such finding is recorded overlooking the evidence which is placed on record or misreading the evidence, with probably in the absence of the evidence. If there is an error in arriving at the findings of fact, mere error, that may not be interpreted. But if the lacuna is palpable or the error is apparent on the face of the record, then only you may cause interference. As I have stated earlier, you need not interfere in the matter or cause interference merely because it is permissible or it is legal. But if it is necessary in the order to meet the ends of justice, then you may cause interference. Merely because it is permissible in law, you may not cause. The supervisory jurisdiction exercisable by the court under Article 227 is different from 226. So in this way, now this is so far as the some bigger aspects touching Article 226 and 227. Now the important aspect, one important facet of the jurisdiction, if you exclude that, then there remains nothing, is the public interest litigation. The advent of public interest litigation, you trace it, if you trace it. The previous, the court has exercised, the Supreme Court has, Supreme Courts and High Courts have exercised some innovative principles, and tried to render a justice to those who are in dire need of it. You are aware that during old days, you have the instances of entertaining certain grievances regarding violation of fundamental rights by on receipt of a letter. If you sent a telegram, certain telegrams also were treated as the petitions, and the person who is put in wrongful confinement and praying for a writ of habeas corpus, indulgence was shown by the courts. Now this area, this branch of, or this methodology of public interest litigation has reached such a proportion that any grievance touching the public issues, rights of the civil society at large, are addressed, and the various, and it has probably assumed or occupied a major portion of our life. It has touched all aspects of our life. As a result of interference or entertainment of a public interest litigation, you have settled the issues touching the environment. In northeast area, when the complaint was made that there is a rampant cutting of the jungle and the greenery is coming to an end, the forest cover is losing, the Supreme Court interfered and issued the ban. Purification of the water, various rivers, Ganga river still going on. Then aspects relating to pollution of water pollution, air pollution. The classic example is Delhi. The Supreme Court has and the High Courts have also touched various aspects of our life. Contamination in the food articles, methodology of packaging, distribution. In Goa, while I was there, a petition was presented to me saying that, making a complaint that there is a contamination of fish. There is a lot of some chemical element, formalin, beyond the permissible limit occurring in fish, and therefore it is not eatable. So you ban the import from other states or from other regions. This issue was not investigated, and in fact we had to direct the Fisheries Institutes to lay down the parameters as to what should be the limit, permissible limit. But these are the aspects touching the human life, touching the environment. Apart from this, the aspects of day-to-day life, sometimes we find that in hilly area there is no access for the people, tribal people residing there. There is no lifeline touching to the civil society. They are secluded from the world. They are kept away from the facilities like education, medical facilities, as a result of non-availability of an all-weather road. The Supreme Court entertained a petition and provided it is a part of Article 12. You must an existence merely, and for keeping a person alive is not sufficient. It has to be a human existence. provide him all the facilities which a human being is entitled to. So here also we have entertained certain petitions wherein the complaint was made that in rural area, as a result of non-availability of road, the patients have the difficulty in approaching, availing the medical facilities. If there are provisions made by the state government, it's a basic responsibility of the state government to provide for all these facilities. Now education is made the fundamental right. Providing facilities for education up to a certain age is the responsibility. Merely providing a school is not sufficient. There has to be a proper infrastructure. There has to be a trained teacher. The quality of education is also a part. It's a part of the larger right. If you feel when you make a complaint that the students are opting for the English schools, one has to see that why there is a depletion in quality of education in the schools operated by the Jilla Parishad and the government. So if under the constitutional obligation you are bound to provide education to the students, then there has to be an uniformity. You should not allow any discrimination. The quality of education should be the same throughout. But these are the aspects which touch our daily life. Now, insofar as the surrounding, everything which you are surrounding, all aspects are dealt with, are controlled or monitored by the judicial orders. Providing for health infrastructure, we issue orders to the state government to appoint doctors, to provide medical facilities. You have a national health plan in place, you have a state health plan in place. Do you find that the facilities those are provided are adequate? Now you are exposed to all these things. Take a case of the judicial infrastructure, whether we have the adequate judicial infrastructure. Cases are piling up, we don't have sufficient number of judges to deal with the cases. So when you say that to access to the justice is a right, then the remedy has also to be provided for. So the advent of this public interest litigation has put a change the whole scenario. I would say that when you say that the law is an instrument of social engineering, then one has to make use of this engineering skill for improving the lives of the people. Is it not our response? Sometimes in the course of my lecture, I have said somewhere that most of our advocates, we come from rural areas. Are we aware of the problems facing us? If we deal with those problems, approach the proper forum for redressal of grievances, that would make the lives of our lives and lives of the people surrounding us better. So one has to contribute, one has to think of the innovative methodologies, contribute for this development, contribute for making the lives of the people better by adopting an innovative methodology and seeking various directions which are permissible within four corners of law. So merely, this is what is the public interest litigation. When Justice Krishna Iyer visited our bench, he dealt with this issue. He said that we don't want this system. They made reference to the judges, saying that we can't do this and we can't do that. Where to find out the methodologies, innovative ideas for rendering justice to those who need it most, and for making the existence of a person a human existence. The lives of the people, merely saying that Article 2021 is there, that's not sufficient. The existence must be a human. There are one can speak for hours together on many aspects, but due to limitation, probably it would be better if I stop here.
Thank you so much, sir. Many questions of our attendees have already been addressed with this elaborate session. There are few questions which I would like to present to you with your kind permission.
Yes.
The first question that we have is, can the notification issued by the Honorable Chief Justice be challenged before Honorable Division Bench, and that too at any other bench other than the principal seat?
No, so far as the allotment of judicial business is concerned, it's a prerogative of the Chief Justice. If the Chief Justice has issued certain notification, certain administrative order that these categories of matters shall be listed at this place, the Chief Justice is within his rights to do so. If it is required to be challenged at Mumbai, it shall be challenged at Mumbai.
Thank you, my lords. The next question is it proper to ask litigants to deposit money in PILs in view of access to justice for all?
I will tell you, because that aspect I have not touched. Many a times you must have come across the cases that there is a rampant abuse of this facility, this public interest litigation. People try to settle their score or some element of animosity amongst them by approaching the court. I will tell you one example. At Nagpur, and petition is presented. So somebody had brought it to my notice that some industry is sold in auction, which has been purchased by somebody who is in political life, political career. There may be various challenges, but the person who raises a challenge has some political agenda, has some personal interest. So if you find that the litigation which is initiated, as the Supreme Court calls it, as a paisa interest litigation or devoid of any public interest, in order to ensure that if at the end of the day, while delivering the judgment, if you come to the conclusion that this is a frivolous litigation, you can penalize the person. That amount, you can ensure that the money which he has deposited would be forfeited. And nowadays, we are coming across many of such cases wherein there is a lot of suppression of fact. The person who approaches the court approaches with the distorted fact. Whatever is told is half truth. Then when you feel something palpable, when you feel something that probably this may not be a purely having the public interest character, in order to discourage such litigants, the amount is directed to be deposited, and there are rules framed in that regard, and it is well within the powers of the court.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Next question. Do you believe that permitting pleadings or averments in Marathi before High Court would help making writ jurisdiction under Article 226 more democratic, accessible, and friendly for common public?
The use of Marathi as such is not at all prohibited as such. The official language of the court is English. So it's not that we don't read the documents in Marathi. We entertain and we encourage the people also to tender the documents in Marathi. If somebody says that, look here, a partying person approaches and says that, look here, I am not conversant with the English language, I will address you in Marathi. And if I understand the Marathi, there is nothing wrong in accepting his request and hearing him. So many a times we do this. Many a times the litigant comes and addresses us in Marathi. But the difficulty arises when somebody, some judge from some other state, if he is not aware of the Marathi language, then you may have to provide the translation. Otherwise, the writing of the judgments in English has to be there because the official language of the High Court is English. You can't write the judgments in English, Marathi.
My
But
lord.
we entertain the arguments, and you be more comfortable in your mother tongue, in addressing your mother.
My lords.
So far as the advocates are concerned, it would be, look here, the one has to follow some uniformity. You can't permit the advocates to address the arguments in Marathi.
The further question says, though oral submissions in Marathi are permitted, pleadings are still supposed to be in English. How to deal with this?
No, pleading the, look here, if the party in person approaches and says that, all right, I will tender the pleading in Marathi, his petition is also maybe sometimes in Marathi. Then if the judge doesn't know the Marathi, you may ask for some translation. Otherwise, we have the official translators, we can get it translated.
My lords.
But it's not merely a matter of pride. It should be a matter of really some, if it leads to rendering justice, then there is no impediment for that, making justice.
My lords. The next question is whether the High Court should put a matter in framework while remanding the matter to subordinate courts or quasi-judicial authorities. Does it benefit the subordinate courts or it affects the jurisdiction of the lower courts?
Kindly repeat it. I am not understanding.
Whether the High Court should put a matter in framework while remanding the matter to subordinate courts or quasi-judicial authorities. And does this benefit the subordinate courts or it affects the jurisdiction?
No, suppose if certain matter is required to be sent back, and if the High Court directs the tribunal or the subordinate court to deal with the certain aspects in recorded in the order, there must be a conscious thought. The court must have applied his mind while framing the issues or putting the framework that the matter raises this and this issue, and you have to answer this. It may not be necessary to deal with the other aspects or dwell beyond the framework or the issues which are necessary to decide the dispute. Then what is wrong in, sometimes what happens, that certain issues are remitted back. Issue is framed and the court, trial court or the tribunal is directed to record evidence on that issue and sent it back along with the finding. So that is permissible under law, even under civil procedure code also. I will tell you one example. In a criminal appeal also this was done. The issue was regarding the handwriting of an what you call a dying declaration. The condition was that the dying declaration is not recorded or written by the executive magistrate because his handwriting differs if you compare his signature. The court directed that, all right, take evidence, record the evidence on this and report it back to that.
Thank you, sir.
I think, is it expected or something else is it?
My lords, that is the question. The answer is quite satisfactory. The next question is, what should be the extent of interference by courts in fiscal matters in the backdrop of COVID pandemic? How shall courts strike a balance in such situations?
Now look here, I have some different opinion in this. Probably this is not supported by the views taken by the apex court and others. Look here, the finances or fiscal matters is also a part of life. In order to make the life of an individual meaningful, the economic aspects are equally important. Now take a case it's a modern day, the society is complicated, then the transactions, those are, and the interpersonal relations, commercial relations, those have become quite complex. And with the advent of technology, this complexity has increased. Now we have opened the doors for international trade. We are affected by the happenings which are taking place throughout the world. Now, when you talk of an independence of a person, you must also keep in mind the economic independence. If you talk of the equality, then you must talk of equality in the matter of distribution of resources. If an existence of a human being is to be rendered meaningful, then he must have access to the resources, to the financial resources, so as to make his life meaningful. Then in such context, in such scenario, the fiscal matters is also, can it not be a part of the your scheme of right to life? Now take a case of we have dealt with an issue of farmer suicide. One of the causes, major causes, is that non-availability of finances, banking facility. In Vidarbha, the number was more because there is no access to the banking facility, there is no access to the finances. Now, where you nationalize the banks, now thereafter you have started amalgamating. What is the result? The branches which are situated in rural areas are closed. So where is the access to the finances to the agriculturists? Now take a case of distribution of the finances to the agriculturists. I will tell you that's barely 8% or 7%, whereas the industrialists, they get about 70 or 80%. Top 10 industrialists or top 10 borrowers have the debt that contributed to the debt of about 70%, 10,000, more than 10,000 crores is about 60 or 40 or 50% is cornered by only 10 individuals. Above 100%, there are 200 or 300 persons. Whereas, though the Reserve Bank of India directs that some 6% or so finances should be made available for agriculture, you don't make it. So is it not the part of the right to life in order to make the life of an agriculturist meaningful? Is it not necessary that you must provide him access to the finance? So whenever some these aspects are touched, there is a resistance at the top of the voice saying that you are interfering in the fiscal matters. But the fiscal matters have become more important. It touches your right to life. Now look at about 7 lakhs or 8 lakhs crores are cornered by a few individuals, about no, maybe below 1,000. And how much is the burden shared by this liability shared by the agriculturist class or some small industry? Very negligible. Now previously there was a policy during Manmohan Singh's regime. They say that the top defaulter, name of top defaulter should be published by the Reserve Bank of India. And they published the list. A name of a leading lawyer was, son of a leading lawyer was included there, and in the next revision, his name was removed. To what extent? Because it's not that everything cannot be wrapped up below the carpet. Merely because you bring in certain legislation saying that this is a finance bill because it affects the finances. But this in my humble opinion, I may be wrong, but this is a holy cow. This has to be touched.
Thank you, my lords. The next question relates to this. Are courts required to be more proactive in wake of COVID situation, and in what ways?
Yes, I will tell you that this COVID pandemic has opened a new vista. This may lead to some different situation in all walks of life. Now, the problems that may arise post-COVID would also be peculiar. Those may touch the mercantile issues, the contractual aspects. And one may have to think seriously about the right of an individual's right of the right to the livelihood. Then, as I have said, that you may have to also scrutinize the fiscal policies also. Look here, after this pandemic, it has everybody has awakened to the fact that the labor class in unorganized sector in India is more than 90%. They don't have any access to the government schemes. Is there any protection for this large class? In such situation, at least as per the conservative estimate, 40% of the population, this casual labor, have lost their livelihood. Is it not the responsibility of a welfare state to ensure that this unorganized sector also has an access to the facilities or statutory protection, financial protection, or certain schemes to enhance their quality of life? They may not have the security in respect of their employment, but one has to make sure that if somebody is a casual labor, at least he regard must be had for providing the human facilities, that is for shelter, sufficient amount to feed him 2 times a day, for his kids, his old parents, at least provide something basic for a human being. Now, this episode of this influx of all these laborers who are walking for thousands of kilometers in lakhs has opened our eyes. Are they not the citizens of India? They are the citizens of India, having all the rights and must have the access to all these facilities or the welfare schemes. How can you shut your eyes to the agony of these persons? You may have to bring new policies, prepare some legislation. Otherwise, it's a human bomb ticking below you. It may explode any time. So these are my extreme views. May not be uh, may not prove relevant on the touchstone of legal principles. But if you say that the object of law is like a social engineering, then we must evolve the methodology. We must find out some ways and means to address this problem, alleviate the sufferings of these people who are our fellow Indians. You cannot put a barriers of state, caste, color in such things. Everybody should have sufficient resources to lead a human life. That's what our constitution says, and for that only we have adopted it. So it's a responsibility of a right thinking advocate and all the judges to ponder about this. And if you take steps or issue directions, it's not an interference in the area occupied by some other arms. These are the human problems, must be resolved in a human way, human manner. And we must find out the innovative ways for addressing these problems. So these fiscal matters, non-interference in fiscal matters, all right, you may not stop the payment of taxes. But if 8 lakh crores and 10 lakh crores are being cornered by 100 or 200 individuals, this is our money, we put it in the bank. Are we not to ask them questions?
My lords. Thank you, my lords. The next question that we have is, what would you suggest lawyers to follow while dealing with matters under its jurisdiction? Any word of advice for junior advocates that we should be following?
Look here, I would advise the junior advocates to keep in mind, bear in mind, that look here, this profession of advocacy may be a source of your livelihood, but the object is not to amass the wealth in a shortest possible time. It's a sort of a social service. When you call the judicial system that we are social engineers, we look at the grievances of the general public, then there has to be our contribution also, must inculcate the sense of justice. It is my opinion that the sense of justice shall flow in your veins like a blood, at least for judges at least. And the advocates are not merely, their task is not to put up the case of their client and see that by hook or crook the verdict is received in their favor. One has to be patient. You have to contribute for the benefit of the judicial system. You have a responsibility towards the judge as well as your responsibility towards the client. You are an officer of the court, must behave like an officer of the court. Don't indulge in the extra legal maneuvers. Be patient, success will follow. Keep an eye to the surroundings. Look at the problems and miseries of your fellow citizens in your village. Find out as to what you can do for them. If you do something, every advocate coming from a village does something for his village, for his community, that would be a service to the nation. I would suggest that you, by way of a public interest litigation, if you can enforce certain obligations for public good, at least for your villagers, that would be a great service.
Thank you, my lords, for your words of wisdom. Due to paucity of time, I have this one last question. An attendee wants to know about your experience in the use of writ of habeas corpus during emergency, if that is okay with you. Your experience.
Now the issue is settled. Issue is settled. ADM Jabalpur. In fact, the majority judgment at the relevant time said that the fundamental rights are suspended, including the Article 20 and 21. High Court took a bold view, said that we can examine the procedure, if it is within the framework of law. And High Courts such as Bombay High Court and certain other High Courts interfered. But thereafter, when there was a change in the political scenario, the 44th Amendment was brought in, and the 259, Article 259, makes an exception so far as Article 20 and 21 is concerned. And Article 32 is also said that judicial remedies are never suspended; those are always available. Those are guaranteed. Sub-article says that those are guaranteed. So it was a sort of a black spot, but that has gone away because by passage of time. And it's a poetic justice that that judgment is undone. I would not say.
Thank you so much, my lords. On behalf of the Lex Discourse team, I express my sincere gratitude for your valuable time and insights. Your presence has made today's webinar a grand success, which I can fairly state from the number of attendees on Zoom and YouTube both. Today, it seems that the intent and object of inception behind Lex Discourse, that was to create a platform to listen, learn, and educate ourselves through intellectuals in law whom we look up to, has been achieved to a greater extent. So thank you, my lords.
Thank you so much. I consider myself to be student. This is a sort of a learning process for me also. After so many days, I opened certain books and read some pages. Thank you so much.
My lords, we are grateful. On this note, Lex Discourse hereby declares to have concluded its first phase. We believe, as lifelong students of law, we will continue on this journey of learning and making ourselves better, as said by you for the greater good. We thank all our attendees and wish you all good health. Stay safe, take care. Thank you, sir.